by the International Comparative and Regional Studies Center and the Sié Center at the University of Denver's Korbel School. This panel is part of a course practicum that Tim Sisk is running this term on elections and conflict dynamics. And we're grateful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which sponsors the Sié Center's Responsible Engagement Program, of which this course is a part. And so the Responsible Engagement Program is all about sort of learning how to engage with the policy world in a responsible way, and inviting in practitioners to work with students is a really great way to do that. So I really commend Professor Sisk for his work on this subject. And so the subject of today's panel is on elections and conflict dynamics. This is something that US scholars used to think happened over there somewhere, but it's increasingly something that animates elections in the United States. We've seen this in many places of the United States, including in Colorado, where issues of election security are a concern. And in fact, Colorado Secretary of State Jena Griswold has received security threats. And so these are sort of live and important parts of the dynamic in the United States and in our state of Colorado, as well as all over the world. And so appropriately, we have 4 expert women to comment on these dynamics. And I will go ahead and introduce them all right now, and then we could just turn to them in turn to hear their comments. So to begin, we have 2 of our Korbel students. The first is Tori Wyman, who is a second-year MA student at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies, focusing on democratic systems and elections and humanitarian assistance. She has worked with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition to promote immigrant rights through voter outreach and inform Colorado voters on the candidates in their area that support immigration rights. And she also does research for the Corporate Human Rights Violations Project at the Daniel School of Business. Good friend of mine, Professor Tricia Olson, runs that project there, where she codes human rights allegations committed by corporations. Her passion for electoral systems continues to grow, and her current focus is on gender quotas and their effectiveness in increasing women's political participation and representation. So welcome, Tori. Next is Callie Mitchell, who's a second-year MA student, also at Korbel School of International Studies. Her academic and research work has focused on women's participation in political and peace processes, gender dynamics of conflict and crises, and inclusive governance for conflict prevention. Callie currently serves as a research assistant for the Sié Center and the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, and also works as a project assistant for International IDEA, which is a nice transition for our next panelist, who's from International IDEA. Therese Pearce Lannela is the head of electoral processes at International IDEA. Pearce Lannela has a background working with elections in the field, headquarters, and policy levels. She served as a founding staff member at International IDEA and as assistant director for the democracy program at the Carter Center. Through work with IFES, UNDP, and IDEA, Pearce Lannela has been deeply involved in the development of a variety of seminal publications, networks, databases, training curriculum on electoral administration, including the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network and the Bridge course package. She's also, before working at International IDEA, served in 1994 through the UNDP for the National Electoral Commission in Mozambique, where I used to have a house. So thank you for doing that. And she's worked on a number of international election observer and election assistance missions. So welcome, Therese. And then last but not least, Korbel professor Hilary Matfess. She's an assistant professor at the Korbel School at the University of Denver, where she's an affiliate with the Sié Center. And she's also a research fellow at the Research on International Policy Implementation Lab. a senior associate non-resident at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Africa program, and a fellow with the George Washington University Program on Extremism. She was a 2020-2021 U.S. Institute Peace Scholar Fellow. And her research is really at the intersection of security, gender, and governance, with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Her first book, Women and War in Boko Haram, was published by Zed Books in 2017. So as you can see, this is a terrific panel. And we will begin in the order of my introductions with Tori.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. Let me make sure this works. All right, can you see my slide? Perfect. Okay. So I have focused my attention, particularly within this course, on gender quotas, focusing on the effectiveness and the skeptic arguments against quotas, and then focusing on 3 Middle Eastern states throughout this project. So to begin, just a quick overview, I'm going to first introduce gender quotas and who decides to adopt them, then provide some best fit combinations. So this is combinations of the electoral system with quota systems. And then I will delve into the Middle East case studies that I focused on, as well as the hypocrisies that these states have shown within gender equality. And then conclude with a more in-depth look at Iraq and the system that it provides within gender quotas. Right, so to begin, arguments for quotas. The purpose of quotas is achieving gender equality within the political sphere. So increasing women's participation in politics to that 50% equality line. There are existing barriers for women entering political positions. So compensatory measures like gender quotas should and need to be taken. And these gender quotas can promote and actively push forward women's inclusion in the decision-making process. With these arguments for quotas, as I mentioned, there are also several skeptic viewpoints with quotas that are important to take into consideration. The first is the percentage change of women in political participation in political positions is not equivalent to improved gender quotas and norms. That's important to note. There's also the concept of state feminism, which is when a state or political party will implement female-forward policies such as gender quotas, not necessarily because they believe in the importance of gender equality, but they believe it can help the state's economy. There's also the idea that once women are elected and become part of the political parties and political elite, that they abandon traditional women's issues. This is something a lot of research has been focused on and continues to be focused on. Then finally, this idea of a ceiling of representation. So rather than gender quotas being seen as an initial step towards gender equality, states and political parties see it as the only thing that they need to implement, or this is an argument that skeptics make. So there are 3 main types of gender quotas that I will focus on within this report. The first is legislated candidate quotas. This is the most common type of quota used throughout the world. And this is when a state will set a legal requirement for the minimum share of women on the political candidate list. So in terms of nominations, not in terms of physical seats. This can be implemented in the state's constitution and or their electoral laws. It can also be implemented nationally and or subnationally. And these legislated candidate quotas apply to all political parties. You then have these reserve seat quota systems, which is what I'll be focusing on within the Middle East case studies. This is when a state regulates the number of women elected. So they set aside a certain percentage of seats for women. So this is ensuring that there is a minimum number of seats for women within the political system. Then you have the third and final one, political party quotas. These are very similar to the legislated candidate quotas, but they're set by the individual political party. So it's purely on a voluntary purpose and basis. So this is a graph from International Ideas Gender Quota Database, and it presents the various quotas used across the globe. So we can see that the yellow, there's states that have implemented legislated candidate quotas. The orange is reserve seat quotas, and the blue is political party quotas. And if you take a little bit deeper look at this map, you can see a bit of a pattern. And this is in terms of who decides to adopt these quotas. So we will see that the yellow and the blue, so the legislated and the political party quotas, tend to be adopted by stronger democracies and regular democracies. And then reserve seats, the orange, are more weaker democracies and authoritarian states. So I'm going to move on to this best fit combinations graphic. This is also from Ideas Designing for Equality report. And the following combinations of electoral systems and gender quota systems provide the best circumstances to increase women's political participation. So we'll see some repeated electoral systems like the list PR systems with varying district sizes. We also see block vote, party block vote, and then single transferable vote and SNTV. And these are all similar systems, but differ by their district magnitude. So the number of members in each electoral district. So many of these are multi-member district systems. And then we also see some repeated systems in the quota area. So percentage regulations with placement mandates pops up a lot, as well as reserve seat systems. Now I'm going to go into these Middle East case studies. So I decided to focus on Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Iraq. And I chose these states as they each present unique cases in which the skeptics' arguments that I mentioned prior are present. With that being said, these cases are not representative of all states that adopt quotas, but are important to analyze as a way to improve gender quota implementation processes in the future. So first, I have Saudi Arabia. They have a monarchical system in which their king nominates officials to the Shura Council, which is their equivalent of a parliament. However, Saudi Arabia does not have actual elections in the national level. They do have municipal elections, but those are not affected by gender quotas. So in January of 2020, there is a royal order amendment to the Saudi constitution, altering the formerly all-male council by announcing a 20% reserve seat quota. And so 30 of the 151 Shura member councils must be women. But interestingly enough, also within this royal order, it was stated that women candidates were not allowed to publish their pictures alongside campaigns. On to UAE. UAE also has a monarchical system with a federal national council elections. So 50% of the FNC members are elected, while the remaining 50% are appointed by the king and the ruling party. So in 2018, in December of 2018, there is a presidential decree that declared the implementation of a 50% reserve seat gender quota. And this really put the UAE on the map in terms of women's political participation, because they now ranked third highest, just behind Costa Rica and Nicaragua, for women's participation. So 20 of their 40 members must be women. However, in the most recent elections, only 7 women were actually elected. So the remaining 13 were appointed by the ruling party. And then finally, Iraq. Iraq is considered a weak democracy. They have a parliamentary system with national and subnational elections. And in 2009, there was an amendment to their electoral laws, which stated that the proportion of women shall not be less than 1/4 of the winners. So this is equal to about 1 seat per constituency for a woman within Iraq. And that requires 82 of the 329 seats in their parliament to be women. However, just recently in their October 2021 elections, 98 women were elected. So this was more equivalent to a 30% control in the seats, which is something that hadn't happened before. Iraq is also different than the other two systems I just described because they have what's called legal sanctions for non-compliance. So this means if a woman candidate does not receive enough votes to meet that one seat per constituency, the woman candidate with the highest amount of votes, whether that supersedes the male candidate or not, is elected. They also have a rank order list, which means within the candidate list, every third candidate must be a woman. And this ensures that the candidates, all the women candidates, are not just simply placed at the end of the list. I then have, each state also has some hypocrisies involved within their gender equality systems, and takes part in various hypocritical actions that further hurt women rather than support them. So there's certain states that have the male guardianship system in varying degrees still in place, illicit sex laws, which is sex outside of marriage laws, varying degrees of domestic violence, as well as inability to meet qualifications to become suitable candidates within the electoral system. And despite all of these failings, what I've found through my research is that many global gender reports seem to either overlook them or not take the entire context of the gender scenario within the state. For example, one of the reports I worked with, the World Economic Forum, reported that in just a year, the UAE jumped 48 spots in the Global Gender Gap Report and 51 spots in the Political Empowerment Indice. So just if you look at the 2019 report and the 2020 report, the only difference was that 50% gender quota. They didn't really implement any other positive women's rights, gender equality policies, but jumped 51 spots of 156 in that report. In comparison, Iraq's political empowerment score was 189 compared to UAE's 24, despite having those stipulations in place to ensure women's political participation that the UAE does not have. And these cases are not meant to discourage the implementation of gender quotas, but to provide a critical analysis of how states use quotas for alternative underlying reasons. And these examples can present the danger of window dressing. These cases are also meant to encourage further analysis past a simple percentage change in women's participation so that we can see a more overarching understanding of the gender scenario in each state and provide feedback for better implementation of these gender quotas. And then finally, I want to focus on Iraq and the systems that I just described, as they're more unique than the other systems within the Middle East. So again, they have these sanctions for non-compliance as well as rank order stipulations. They're also the only state in the region to surpass its quota percentage without any necessary appointments. It also qualifies under one of those best fit combinations that I went over. So they have a multi-member district, single non-transferable voting system with a best loser reserve seat system. And this actually mirrors the past Taiwanese system. They've since changed their electoral system. But Taiwan had, again, a very similar system, and their current women's participation rate is now at 42%, and they recently just re-elected their first woman president in the state's history. And so while Iraq has only recently begun its democratic transition, and there's still a lot of conflict, particularly within the past election, we can see that Taiwan's success hopefully provides hope for future elections in Iraq and the the increased political participation and representation of women within the state and within the region. So that is my report. I'm welcome to take any questions, comments, and just want to also thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic. I appreciate it.
Great, thanks so much, Tori. And that gives me an opportunity to also say, if people do have questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A and we'll collect them so that people can answer. We'll have about 30 minutes of Q&A time at the end, assuming we all keep to our time. And so I will, let me turn it over to Callie.
Thank you. I will be sharing my research brief on understanding and preventing violence against women in elections. Political gender equality is fundamental to democracy. Recent years have been marked by the significant increase in the participation of women in political processes across the globe. Women currently account for over 25% of parliamentarians worldwide and are progressively active in political spaces. Despite these advancements, progress is painfully slow. It is estimated that gender parity won't be achieved in politics until 2070. Efforts to thwart women's political participation are not a new occurrence. These efforts take place in both mature and young democracies, and while they may take many forms, one of the most alarming and harmful is the perceived increase in perpetration of violence against women. During the Biden administration's 2021 Democracy Summit, responding countries ranked combating gender violence high among their commitments to strengthening democracy. While violence against women in politics occurs in several different contexts, it has unique and detrimental impacts on women during the electoral cycle. This scoping review of violence against women in elections seeks to disentangle gender dimensions of election-related violence from the larger field of electoral violence research in order to better understand violence against women in elections as its own phenomenon. The rise in both democratic governance and attempts to undermine it have led to a growth in scholarly attention being paid to the phenomenon of electoral violence at all levels. Scholars assert that the transformative nature of democratic progress in fragile context results in anger, uncertainty, and violence, which presents a threat to electoral integrity, given its efficacy at reducing electoral participation by 42%. In comparison, violence against women in elections has received relatively little scholarly attention, generally due to scarcity of reporting and data, as well as a lack of understanding about the issue and stigma attached to gender-based violence in many societies. Given the distinct features of the perpetration of violence against women in electoral processes, employing a gendered lens when considering electoral violence illuminates the importance of examining violence against women in elections in its own right. Electoral violence has generally been defined as any action or threat of action that involves physical harm or psychological intimidation with the intention of delaying or influencing the electoral process or outcomes. Research shows a variation in motives for election-related violence. While some actors object to elections on principle and do not find elections to be a legitimate method for the transfer of power, other perpetrators of electoral violence oppose the ruling system or party and aim to prevent certain leaders from being elected. UN Women defines violence against women in elections as a form of violence intended to impact the realization of women's political rights in an electoral context. In this way, women are targeted because of their sex. Violence against women in elections is rooted in misogyny and societal inequality. It often occurs as a backlash against women's increased participation and is motivated by the instrumental desire to prohibit the participation of women in politics. Violence against women in elections also has unique enabling conditions, as it may increase in countries that have recently adopted and implemented gender quota laws, and also frequently occurs in countries with greater levels of gender-based inequality where a transgression of gendered spaces is more heavily sanctioned. The variation in motives for the perpetration of general electoral violence and violence against women in election leads, in turn, to a diversity in the way in which violence is performed. When a gendered lens is applied to the perpetration of electoral violence, the existing research suggests that women exercising their electoral rights as voters, supporters, candidates, and family members can experience three forms of violence: physical, sexual, and psychological. Given the more public nature of the act, physical harm is most readily associated with electoral violence. Although physical violence against women is most visible in public settings, at polling locations, in campaign settings, and civic spaces, familial settings are where violence against women transpires most commonly. Physical harm inflicted on women by their spouses and family members in a private and domestic setting is less perceptible, and therefore is not accurately accounted for within studies of overall electoral violence. Sexual violence has also been explicitly employed as a weapon of violence against women in elections in several cases. Sexual violence can be considered opportunistic and related to the institutional degradation, or instrumental with intent to degrade and deter women's participation, and it occurs in domestic, community, and public spaces. While men are more likely to be victims of physical violence, women are more likely to be victims of psychological violence and intimidation. While it's difficult to study this, given its private nature, it has become increasingly prevalent on online spaces in recent years, and psychological violence often precedes physical violence. Understanding impacts means uncovering subjective meanings of violence. Impacts can be gendered in nature without having these gendered intentions. For example, in the 2010 Burundian elections, public markets were bombed and more women were killed. While it's unlikely this attack was related to gender, because more women were victimized, it was interpreted as gender-based violence. In this way, we can understand the feminist claim that gendered violence can occur even when intentionality is not proven. In my scoping review, I assessed 3 major programming tools. The UN Women tool identifies the specific components of violence against women in elections, examines the current responses, and provides programming guidance for practitioners and policymakers to be able to identify, prevent, and respond to violence against women in elections in all phases of the electoral cycle. The IFIS programming guide introduces the concept of gendered electoral violence in fragile and transitional contexts. It also understands the failure of prior frameworks to consider public and private forms of violence against women in elections. Finally, the International IDEA Election Risk Management tool was designed to enhance users' capacities to understand various risk factors, analyze risk data, and take action to prevent risks from materializing and to mitigate negative effects they produce on the credibility of electoral processes. While this tool does not specifically address violence against women in elections, it does consider gender-based violence and discrimination an external risk factor to electoral violence. Additionally, IDEA hosted a workshop in South Africa in order to customize the tool for improved monitoring, prevention, and mitigation of violence against women in electoral processes. Given the upcoming 2022 elections, it is useful to utilize these tools to understand the dynamics of violence against women in elections in Colombia. Using the UN Women tool, we can identify several enabling conditions and risk factors within the Colombia case. The culture of machismo and extreme inequality, in addition to high levels of gender-based violence and a 90% impunity rate for those who commit gender-based violence, provide an enabling environment for violence against women in elections. Additionally, Colombia was the penultimate Latin American country to achieve women's suffrage in 1954. This was met with much resistance from political parties, society leaders, and religious authorities alike. The predominant arguments against women's suffrage were clearly misogynist, with claims that allowing women to vote would leave their homes unattended and that women did not have the mental capacity to vote. In this way, we can understand violence against women in elections as the expression of fear of women's invasion of the public space, and being motivated by the desire to perpetuate subordination of women. Violence against women in elections also manifests in Colombia in several ways. Colombian women between the ages of 18 and 50 are more likely to be victims of election-related violence than men of the same age bracket. The Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy conducted a survey in which 63% of women political participants reported being victimized because of their participation. Political violence trackers have raised alarm bells for the increase of violence against women in politics in Colombia from 2020 to 2021 and in the run-up to the election. Additionally, previous cases of violence against women in elections, such as the candidacy of Ingrid Betancourt, who was held hostage for 6 years as a result of her 2002 presidential run, in combination with high levels of gender-based violence and discrimination, which are considered a risk factor by the IDEA ERM, paint an extremely concerning picture for the security of women as voters, candidates, and public actors during the 2022 election cycle. In order to improve the study and programming for violence against women in elections, we should first look to shift away from gender mainstreaming approaches to research. Gender mainstreaming creates an incomplete picture of the lived realities of both men and women. According to the World Bank, less than 33% of countries worldwide produce sex disaggregated data on issues of violence and intimidation. In order to produce better research and statistics on violence against women in elections and, in turn, devise effective programming and policies for the unique circumstances of electoral violence against women, It is essential that researchers, practitioners, and stakeholders shift from the gender mainstreaming framework to one of sex disaggregated data and evidence collection. The field of violence against women in elections can also be improved by approaching the problem for conflict prevention. Meaningful participation of women in post-conflict peace processes increases the probability of the peace agreement being reached, as well as the likelihood of a peace agreement lasting at least 15 years by 35%. Inclusive political and electoral institutions are foundational to sustainable peace and security. Approaching the prevention and mitigation of violence against women in elections as conflict prevention warrants resources, policies, training, and programming that address the factors underpinning the violence and position violence against women in elections as a threat to human rights, peace, and security. Also, scholars and practitioners should conduct gender-informed vulnerability assessments. Understanding violence against women in elections as a security concern in its own right reveals several other risk factors to account for, including the legal and political context regarding gender-based violence, the prevailing social norms in respect to gender roles and women's rights, civic and electoral education on gender and election violence, outreach of aid and awareness programs for victims, and training of security forces. By implementing violence against women in elections informed risk assessment tools, communities can be better equipped to identify the various capacities in which women can be targeted and develop programming to prevent and mitigate incidents of violence against women in the election cycle. Finally, violence against women in elections programming can be utilized to build electoral management body capacity. Electoral management bodies are able to identify potential entry points for the promotion of women's participation and bolstering of gender equality within their internal operations, as well as externally in the electoral process. Electoral management bodies are also significant in the reporting and sanctioning of violence against women in elections. Electoral management bodies are imbued with the power to disqualify candidates and sanction party members in instances of electoral violence, corruption, or election tampering. Electoral management bodies also play an important role in enforcing gender quota laws. By centering the prevention and mitigation of violence against women in elections as fundamental to the integrity of electoral processes, electoral management bodies are able to develop capacity building initiatives that address gender inequality in elections. In conclusion, given its capacity to constrain women's participation in electoral processes, as well as harm electoral integrity and inclusive politics, violence against women in elections is a global problem deserving of attention from scholars and practitioners. As the recognition of violence against women in elections as its own distinct problem grows, it is important to consider potential pathways for the improvement of its study and programming for prevention and mitigation. We must improve the way that research on electoral violence is conducted to better understand the gendered impacts and begin to approach violence against women in elections in its own right as essential to conflict prevention, accurate risk assessments, and the capacity development of electoral management bodies for electoral integrity. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Callie. Can I just say that these students have been amazing, the super good presentations and exactly on time, which academics never do. So you're gonna have to learn something when you sort of move up. Anyway, let's turn now to Therese, please.
Thanks so much. And I'm also just overwhelmed and so grateful by these just excellent young scholars and how much what I appreciate so much about scholarship in general and about these two presentations is that they give words to things that I've maybe experienced or seen, but as a practitioner, which I see myself as, I didn't know that there was a word for it, or you don't know that that is a phenomenon that exists. And I remember when the Me Too came up and things were pointed out that you don't have to accept that, that's not okay. And it was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Like just that idea of a gendered lens, if you haven't studied in that way, it doesn't dawn on you till someone points it out. And I think this kind of work, to have this kind of scholarship in the election space is really something I'm just so grateful for. What I see, I'll bring a little bit of the Callie mentioned three categories there was the voters and the candidates and those working on the elections. And it's those working on the elections who are closest to my heart. because much of the phenomenon that Callie described is in that space as well, the different types of violence. And where I see the two presentations really, if we put a Venn diagram of those two presentations, one part of that Venn diagram would be, I guess, a cluster which we might call security, safety, and courage. And well, we can see why that would be relevant for violence, but let me argue that that's also relevant for the quotas. And I'm saying this as a practitioner, and International IDEA, where I work, we do promote quotas, but I am painfully aware of the unintended consequences of being sprung into a position where the context is not ready for you. And the first generation in any kind of situation of women's empowerment, it is incredibly tough for that first generation. So if we imagine Tunisia, for example, when they first introduced quotas, if you remember, after the Arab Spring, and Ennahda party just won overwhelmingly, and because they had a zippered system, these young university students, engineering students and so forth, who hadn't planned to be in politics, they were put on those lists, but because the win was so overwhelming, a whole core cohort of them entered in. And luckily, and here's where this issue of safety can come in, luckily in the Tunisian case, there was the safety in numbers. It wasn't just one. And I think that's something to keep in mind with these, with quotas, if we think of how terrifying it is to be the first in an area where you're not particularly welcome or needed, or where the culture doesn't fit very well. And one type of quotas that that wasn't mentioned, that Tori didn't mention, but was at the local level. If we think of India, for example, the panchayat system, where women at the local level are quoted in, and they gain their political experience in that way at the local level, and then maybe are brave enough to work their way, or to work their way up. So that is why I'm putting these words, courage and safety and security, also as applicable as themes for Tories as well as for Callie. And these this idea of security and safety is something that really belongs with elections, and with this course that this is part of the capstone of. That, of course, elections are about conflict. They're about managing conflict in society, but it's not always easy to do that without conflict. And as we get closer to an election period, the agitation rises, the tensions rise, especially as people see power slipping out of reach, or supporters, grievances that may have something to do elsewhere, but because all the focus is on elections, those grievances can play out in that environment. And it's a really exhausting environment to be in. And this could be, from an election management point of view, it can be at the very top level. And that quote that Callie had, that's from an article that came out today on the International IDEA website, which explains why only 22% of women, why only 22% of election management bodies have women heading them, and what is it that's stopping them. It's like, it is exhausting. It is exhausting to be trolled on social media, to just not dare to open your social media, but also for the frontline workers. And we really need to think about them from a safety point of view. So when, Hillary, you've been working in Africa, for example, but even, polling happens in the daytime, but counting happens late into the evening. And polling happens in every community in the country, safe ones and not so safe ones, very remote areas that people have to travel to, and perhaps away from their families. And a scholar that I can really recommend, Nicole Haley, who is an anthropologist in Australia, she's been looking at this space, for example, in Papua New Guinea, what it is like for women who have been propelled, thanks to excellent programming from AusAid, to promote women in leadership in election management bodies. But Nicole looked at what it was like for them traveling away from their families to very remote parts of the highland, and And it was not a very safe picture that was painted. And you can wonder where sexual violence fits in election work. But if you read her work, you can understand how those dynamics can play out when you're away from family. It can be really, really scary work. And those of you who have been election observers will have seen it. You mentioned Mozambique, but I remember very, very well one night in Tete, where counting is done at night with lanterns, because the elections have been done all day and elections are conducted at night. And the head of the polling team was a woman from the community, a teacher, and some real thugs came out when she was counting, and they harassed and harassed and harassed. And she was so brave, but she was exhausted after that long day. And that is not something only for post-conflict areas like Mozambique. This type of behavior is playing out now in Canada, where for the first time they're seeing incivility at the polling station level. And in the United States, there have been just some horrific stories of what polling officials had to put up with in the last elections, for instance, and still today. So this idea of safety and security and courage is one that I want to take with me in my work and explore how we create safe spaces so that people will continue to work for elections or will continue to want to be candidates. And here I'd like to put forward this idea of cohorts, of safe spaces where we think of it being enough. So if we do have programs that put forward people, that there be spaces that if they go out, that they can come back and talk it all through. And there's some gorgeous examples from Tunisia. There's an organization called League of Women Voters, not same name as yours here, but it's a completely, you have to say it in Arabic and French, and it's not the same. But they actually have, safe houses where candidates and so forth can just come, and they can bring their kids, and they can just be themselves, and it's cross-party, and they can have assistants walking home, just somebody who accompanies them. But this idea of safety is one I'd really like to take forward in electoral work as we move forward. So creating safe places. I think I'll leave it at that. But thank you both so much for your for choosing these topics, and I hope you both continue with them. There's plenty more to be done.
Great. Thank you so much, Therese. And I think that those are really wise things to think about, because it's not just sort of getting in, but it's actually managing to be present in these different situations. And as someone who studied security in the early 1990s, when there weren't that many of us, I remember, the advantage was no lines at the women's room, but the cost was there just weren't any other women around. And I never had any safety issues, but the emotional tax on that, I think, is important to consider. And so I really appreciate your remarks. And now we'll turn to Hillary, please.
Thank you so much. And let me just echo how delighted I am to be around such remarkable women, be they students, colleagues, visiting guests of the university. It's a genuine joy on International Women's Day to reflect on the future of women's political participation and the dynamics of it with some genuinely brilliant, remarkable, and thoughtful people. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I've been thinking actually a lot about these dynamics recently with Marie Berry, a professor here as well, and Rudabeh Kishi, the director of research at the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project. I used to work there, so I should be much faster with the acronym. But ACLID, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, we have a paper forthcoming at the International Feminist Journal of Politics, where we ask this question. We kind of have this assumption, all good things are going to go together. And so as you increase the number of women in office, people will very sensibly realize that the inclusion of women in politics is good for everyone, and you'll have a more prosperous and peaceful society. And so these critical changes that were made in the Kenyan constitution in 2010 could have been a real turning point. And so using data from ACLID about political violence targeting women, we did kind of a very basic quantitative assessment of whether or not those claims about how rising descriptive levels of women's political representation affected women's lived experiences of politics. And I think it comes as no surprise to you all, but as a great disappointment to the optimist in me, that we found this really troubling relationship between an increasing level of women's participation in the National Assembly and the number of instances of political violence in which women were targeted. And there's kind of a long, tortuous definition associated with that, and I'll reference you to ACLID, but the broader kind of point being is I've been sitting with these findings somewhat uncomfortably since we first, ran our aggression and sent around an email with the kind of like, because no one wants to say, well, for women's safety, we must keep them out of politics, because that's obviously not the answer. And appeals towards safety have been used to marginalize and to further the exclusion of minority groups, and particularly women. And so then the question becomes like, okay, how do we fix it? How do we have a system that enables the participation of women in politics, but mitigates against the possibility of this violent backlash? And I'm here to tell you, I have the solution. Just kidding, I definitely don't. It's so hard. And our kind of like policy section basically boils down to like, the patriarchy is a real bummer, and we should start eradicating it in all of its manifestations in our economic, political, and social lives, which is deeply unsatisfying as a policy recommendation. So I'm really excited to think through this with you all. One of the things that I thought emerged as a point of commonality across both excellent presentations was this decontextualization of women's empowerment initiative from women's lives. And I actually think this is an area where we can intervene effectively with policymakers and not necessarily talk past one another. Because it's sort of my opinion that a lot of that decontextualization comes from the indicators that policymakers have adopted. So the rise of the Women, Peace, and Security Agenda, UNSCR 1325, all of these national action plans demands that they not only make changes, but they track those changes. And it's certainly easier to count the number of like female identified bodies in parliamentary seats than it is to actually gauge women's authentic engagement in economic, social, and political lives. And I think in our engagements with policymakers, we have to sort of like adopt the improv rule, right? Which is yes and. We can't like wag the finger and say that was so dumb of you to just look at the composition of parliament. Don't you know anything? That's like a very shallow measure, because yes, it's a shallow measure, but women's presence in politics is worth noting. So we have to say yes and. What else can we look at? What more can we track systematically to get a sense of women's earnest political engagement? And I think that's a conversation for another time, since I am about 4 minutes into 10 minutes of comments. But it's something that I want to raise as a group, because I think it's what some of these brilliant young minds that I assume are on this call should be thinking about. And relatedly, a point that emerged across both presentations was this idea of violence targeting women in elections or women in politics as being a part of the spectrum of violence that women face every day. And whether or not that violence is manifesting in their familial relationships, interpersonal relationships, as members of political parties or specific demographic groups, we need to not decontextualize that violence from the nature of threats that women face. And I think that's important in part because the ways that women respond to these threats relate to the myriad of threats that they face. Their coping mechanisms aren't necessarily siloed. I know mine certainly are not. And so I think it's really important to take a holistic view of the threats and the violence and the insecurity that women face as they move about their lives. My second point, which came out in both of these presentations, is that we need to start looking at earnest and authentic participation. In previous work that I've looked at on gender quotas, I've often been frustrated by the narratives about party women, right? And these women are kind of selected by the party and then they're plugged into those seats and then they toe the party line. And while that might matter for descriptive representation, I do think it's important to consider the kind of recruitment dynamics and political party machinations and whether or not they're allowing women to honestly engage with politics. Relatedly, we have to consider the nature of violence in this political system, because earnest political engagement requires not only a kind of merit-based or interest-based recruitment process, but also that women can articulate their political preferences and desires safely. And then a final point, which I think was unspoken but alluded to in both of these presentations, that I hope we can draw out more in the Q&A, is the question of which women, right? Women are certainly not a homogenous group. If any of you listening, like Callie, have been in my class, I kind of harp on this. It's a soapbox. We never talk about like men's political interests. We talk about certain subsets of men. And so expecting all women to experience the political system the same, or to articulate similar political interests or shared political objectives, can be counterproductive in a number of manners. And so I think we need to also consider the ways in which these systems of recruitment or women's ability to be incorporated in quota systems, whether they're voluntary or legislated, and the nature of the violence that they face during their forms of political participation is really critical. Because my suspicion, even though the data on this is hard to find, is that it's a very uneven landscape, and that the burden of violence and the dynamics of exclusion kind of map onto existing social divisions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Q&A, but thank you all again for such thought-provoking work.
Well, great. Thank you so much. All of the remarks I found so useful, and you guys were all like completely on time. It's like you don't even need a chair. It's amazing. So thank you. It's great. And it's interesting because it strikes me, one of the things that has come up is this issue of conflict. And of course, voting is a way of dealing with conflict in a nonviolent way. And I think sort of, teasing out the differences between conflict and conflict that can be really productive. I mean, it's useful to have arguments versus conflict that turns violent and can be kind of suppressing is an interesting thing to think about. And I really like the idea, Hillary, of this earnest engagement. I do a lot of work on pragmatism, and it's all about getting to that honest moment where you all of a sudden realize the person you're arguing against actually has a point, and then you learn something. And I'm like struggling with how to sort of make people see that, aside from through, very painstakingly cultivated examples where you're, participant observation, sorry. Anyway, so I would love to hear more on that. And then the final thing is the issue of which women. I think that's so important. Which women are harassed, which women face violence, which women get elected. Those kinds of things I think are critically important. And if anything of the last 10 years, if it's taught us anything, it's taught us to sort of begin to break down those categories, which I think is really important. So I am seeing no questions. So I'm going to have to school the audience. Please ask your questions. And maybe let me turn to Tori and Callie to see if you have any thoughts, responses to the other presentations. Tori, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so going off the question of which women are elected, focusing on the 3 case studies that I did, with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because their systems are, well, specifically Saudi Arabia, where it's not elections, it's appointments. The reality of there being an appointment of a woman who is against the ruling party and ruling elite is highly unlikely. Yeah. And in the case of the UAE, where 50% of the FNC is elected and 50% of them are appointed, arguments have been made that what is the point in electing women when half of them can be appointed, and then again, be appointed by the ruling elite. So that's where, again, my skeptic view and other skeptics of how gender quotas are implemented in relation to the electoral system comes into play, because in those systems, again, it's unlikely for their women to have a large say in increasing woman positive policies. And that's also where Iraq diverges a bit, because they have national and subnational elections that are where women are elected by the people and not by the political parties. So that's why I want to focus on Iraq, in the hope that it hopefully can provide for other states in the region and then just in the world in general of how to adopt a quota system and have those stipulations of sanctions for noncompliance and rank order lists.
Great, thank you, Tori. Callie, do you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Dr. Matfus's comment on electoral violence being just a part of the larger violence that women experience every day. I think that was a major shortcoming that I found in a lot of the tools, was just disentangling. It's really hard to disentangle the motives of violence to the impacts. And it's also very normalized in a lot of contexts. And so in that Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy survey, for example, while 63% of respondents said they were victims of violence, only 40% of them said that it was anything out of the ordinary. And most of them felt that it was sort of the general cost of doing politics, and it's not anything that would be extraordinary or problematic. So
Fascinating. So Therese, I wondered if you could, just from your experience on the ground, maybe talk a little bit about how we might think about this notion of authentic participation, and whether, you in your experience, in the kinds of data that IDEA collects, if you have sort of thoughts on how we can entertain those kinds of concerns more effectively.
Yeah, I think we're at a really, really special moment in, when we look back at like different phases of history. When I started working in 92, which shows my age, but it was that idea that democracy was this forward march, and that we had some kind of a solution and a formula, and it was just a matter of rolling it out. And now, okay, we're seeing we have to maybe think this through again. But I think some things are worth, there's a lot of things from that we took as assumptions that maybe are time to reassess. But there are also some that I think are very, very much worth taking forward. And let me take two in particular. And one is the value of our institutions. As we see, and here IDEA really tracks with our global state of democracy, but we track the increasing authoritarian tendencies in the world, and this deliberate undermining of democratic institutions, like this, systematic unpacking of it. And when you do that, it's like, well, what is left? And I think that many of us in other parts of the world who emerged from authoritarian rule, if we think of South America, for instance, when they emerged from authoritarian rule, there was a real sense of, we have got to put in the Constitution, we've got to put protective measures in to make sure that the democratic institutions are able to withstand another dictator, that they can withstand any possible dismantling in the future. So whether constitutional means, or whether bringing up things like election commissions up to almost like a fourth branch of government, a very high level. Same in India. That didn't happen in the older democracies, and it's maybe something to start thinking about now. Is that we to take our institutions very more seriously, and that also means resourcing those institutions. Like how if we think of the electoral authorities in the U.S., for instance, or dealing with triple threats of, trying to organize elections in a pandemic and quickly moving to alternative forms of voting, whether it's, breakneck speed, moving to postal voting, but also the types of violence and polarization and lack of civility that we're seeing, and the difficulties of organizing an election anyways, but not properly resourced, without proper training, without real professional development. Remember, it's temporary workers often, either county officials who do it every now and then, or else those who are teachers and so forth who are working at polling stations. And how do we value their work? So I think paying attention to our institutions is one thing. And then the other one is this sense of community building. And I loved your example of when you talk to someone who's a bit different from you and you find out that they're actually pretty nice and pretty smart. And I was just telling a colleague today about this show, Fab Five, that you have here. It's called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. And I was saying, this group goes into communities that you wouldn't think that they would get along, and yet these beautiful meetings happen. And I think that if that community level work is something, I think in the early days of election work we may have missed, but I think it's worth re-engaging in. And there I think we can really learn from Southern Africa after apartheid, where they were not going to go forward with democracy without bringing all the people with them, with very intensive civic education drives and community discussions about what is a constitution and what does it mean for us. And those are practices that we've been complacent about in Europe, for instance, and we should maybe learn from those experiences. So community work and valuing our institutions are two things I would put forward.
That's great. That's great. I've actually done a bit of field work in Peru the last few years, where I have similarly found some really interesting ways in which they promote engagement. This is around sort of conflict around mining, not elections, but thinking there's ways in which the US could really learn from those kinds of policies. So that's great. Thank you very much. And we do have a question for Tori. Except for she already answered it. And now
I just answered it, but I can answer.
Nobody else can see besides a panelist. So maybe you can talk about what the question was and then answer.
Sure. Yes. So Kelsey asked about an increase in gender-based violence around the time initiatives were undertaken to increase female participation in government. And I didn't focus much on gender-based violence during electoral times within my report, but I did find within my research during the October 2021 elections for Iraq that there was a lot of violence towards women voters and women candidates. However, these elections saw the largest amount of women candidates ever in Iraqi elections. So there's differing amounts, but one of the ones I saw most recently was there's 2,600 female candidates in this past elections, which is crazy. So despite violence and intimidation, the women still came out, still voted, still ran for political positions. So I think that just provides some hope again for the way that the Iraqi gender quota and electoral systems are implemented and run.
Great, thank you. So I didn't know, Hillary, do you want to respond to anything that anyone has?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great points, and I feel like this call could extend hours, if not for impending dinner deadlines for both myself and the dogs. One of whom just popped in upon hearing the D word. But one thing I think it's interesting to draw out more is in addition to these kind of structural barriers that may vary according to the electoral system, as Tori kind of beautifully explained, but there are also these normative expectations. And so a few years ago, Frances Rosenbluth, who recently passed away and was an advisor of mine at Yale, worked on a paper with Josh Kalla and I believe Don Teal, where they talked about in the United States, there's sort of this willingness, a reported willingness to vote for female candidates. But the female candidates that they want to vote for have all of these trappings of like traditional feminine ties, right? So it's like, we want to vote for, a mom with 2 kids who like has a successful business, but is also a politician. And it's like, you don't want to vote for women, you want to vote for superwoman. And so they describe it as this double bind because I've heard childbirth and parenting is quite time consuming, which might make it difficult to pursue a career in politics. And I think that's another area that's kind of tricky to quantify, but speaks to the importance of shifting norms as well around what we expect out of female candidates. Because if we expect perfection, we're bound to either not elect women or be profoundly disappointed when they prove themselves to be human.
Right. Actually, you're reminding me of Anne-Marie Slaughter's article a few years back, You Can't Have Everything. And many people, of course, looked at that and say, what, you were like dean of the Wilson School and you were, the policy planning staff at the, you did have everything. But, she talked really honestly in that article about the way that the tax that took, particularly on her family. And it's interesting because I feel like over the course of my career, we do at least talk more openly now about the fact that we have these other lives and that they sort of butt up against some of the academic norms. But I think you're absolutely right. When you start thinking about the political realm, having sort of more space for that is going to be an important element in this, as well as Anne-Marie Slaughter, of course, had Andy Moravchik, who was staying at home with the kids. That's important too. But thanks for that. So we are getting toward the end. I want to give Callie another chance to weigh in if you'd like, and maybe we'll end with a sort of last word from Therese. So nice to have you here.
Yeah, I will contribute to Tori's answer to Kelsey's question. There were not a ton of data points on upticks in electoral violence against women in response to gender quota laws, but actually I did see a bit of data to suggest the opposite, that once the quota laws were adopted and women were elected, there was more harsh punishment for gender-based violence, and that these laws against gender-based violence were better enforced because of the inclusion of women.
Great, thank you. I love you guys did a lot of work. You have data points for many things. That's great. So Therese, let me turn to you for the last.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and I hope that we can continue working closely with the University of Denver, because I think this opportunity to create a space to think through things is so valuable to me and my colleague Sié, who are here this week. So we'd love to continue that. But this topic has just had me reflect on these 30 years, and when I came into elections, I started with post-war elections, working with the United Nations in the field, and I started with Cambodia and then Mozambique and then on to others. But security was seen as guns and military, and it was just automatic. You organized an election and you had military and you dug trenches and that was your security. And I think with what I would like to see is a reframing of security along many of the lines that we've been talking about today, but is to and I think that's where more types of people, that see security and safety in many different ways, but in a community-based way. And I don't know if it's okay to say that's that perhaps more women involved helps to see security of our electoral processes as something that is not about guns necessarily, but is about building earnestness, the authenticity, or that Hilary was talking about, but just that it's something that we genuinely value, and the security comes from working with that, and not these other ways. So I'd love to move more in that space moving forward.
Yeah, well, now I think you're a plant, because like so much of my career has been focused on trying to get people to think about security in different ways. And you know, I mean, what's really interesting, I think, as we've watched in Ukraine, is the ways in which these kind of heartfelt concerns have real important power, including you know, the absence of them, you know, limiting power. And you've seen that with the Russian forces, I think, to some extent, where the sort of low morale, the feeling like that, you know, your government doesn't have your back, actually matters for, you know, relationships matter, period. We edited a book once where that was the conclusion, 3 women. But I think more than that is relationships matter for your ability to actually exert force, as well as for your ability to get along. And so I think that that's a really great way to end it, is we need to think about, you know, how these issues interact, and think about security in a much broader way. So that's terrific. Well, unless there are any sort of last questions or burning things to say, I think this has been a terrific panel. I really appreciate the chance to chair it. Thanks to Tim Sisk for that. And appreciate all of your remarks so much. I think this has been a great example of what including more women in the debate can yield, which is a really productive conversation. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to our audience, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.